Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's always scary to not understand the language, but hear words like Brexit kind of come in the description. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about the use of digital footprints in research and invite you to hopefully think a little bit differently about your next research project. This is an illustration of the Bosphorus Bridge from a test that I developed with my colleagues in Cambridge. And what it symbolizes is one of the team roles that the test assesses. So it symbolizes the mediator, because the Bosphorus for me is symbolic of bridging east and west. And what I'll try to do, and in a sense what we try to do in the Psychometric Center in Cambridge, is bridge both that tradition of social science research methods and psychometrics, which has been around a long time, and some of the new developments that we see happening around big data, digital footprints, artificial intelligence. In the Psychometric Center, we combine lots of different methodologies to try and answer the research questions we're interested in. Those include computer science, psychology, clinical research, education, linguistics, mathematics, and quite a broad range. But what unifies all of that is our shared interest in understanding human behavior and performance. And part of that is understanding psychology. So what you might not have thought is that all of those digital footprints you leave behind, whether that be through your phone, your Facebook account, your Twitter, your credit card, where you listen to music, the concerts you go to, who you follow, what conferences you attend, and so on, all of that is actually psychometric information. It contains data that, analyzed in the right way, can reveal certain psychological attributes. And this makes you think a little bit differently about what we are familiar with as the traditional kind of market research process. So grossly oversimplifying, this is kind of where the tradition is coming from. We recruit participants to a study, we ask certain questions, and we analyze that data using a variety of techniques and produce a report. But what I'd like you to think about today is the situations where you might be able to predict those answers. So maybe not even needing to ask any questions at all, because that question might have been answered somewhere in digital form. What this allows you to do, because this speeds up the process of assessment significantly, is actually start learning iteratively while you're designing the questionnaire sometimes. So you'd start thinking not about recruiting participants and waiting for them to submit data or answer data, but more about targeting people that you most want to speak to. So we're familiar with having generally representative demographic samples, but maybe less familiar with having representative ranges of psychometric profiles in our sample. So that's what I'll invite you to think about today. So if there's one thing you can take away from this speech, it's to think about situations where you might be able to access a retrospective record of behavior in which you might find many more answers than the ones you were trying to answer in the first place. Our experience with using digital footprints in research started back in 2007. So this was early days of Facebook. There were only a few hundred Facebook apps. Now there are tens of millions. And my colleague created an app called My Personality, which allowed you to take validated psychometric tests used in scientific research for decades, completely for free, and to receive your results. So this was very disruptive, because normally you have to pay to find out your results on those tests. And it was a very, very rich resource that we've since open sourced and shared with academics around the world. What participants could also do after taking the psychometric test is share their Facebook history with us. So this is possible through the Facebook Graph API, and we now have 10 years worth of data of behavior. So everything you liked, the status updates, the language you used, who you're connected to, who you're friends with, and lots of other information. So what we do is correlate those psychometric test scores with the social data. And I hasten to add that all of the data that we use is completely opt-in. So we don't do any crawling of social media. We just use that data that people opted in to share with us, and we're very fortunate that over 6 million people volunteered their data for this research. Some of the things that we found, and I'm just picking out 2 of the 45 papers in the last 5 years that our collaborators have published, is that what you do on Facebook and your other digital footprints are highly informative about psychological traits. So using only your Facebook likes and the pages that you like, we can predict things such as personality, your intelligence, sexual orientation, ethnicity, age, gender, and lots of other things. And to be honest, we haven't found the limit yet of what is predictable, simply because we are constantly generating more and more digital records. We create online personas for ourselves all the time. And while no one of those personas is a complete picture of who we are, they all contain some information which, brought together, can give us a great insight. What we've also shown is that these models are beating humans at our own game. So we've evolved to assess some of these traits, but we find that digital footprints are so informative and so clean a signal of certain behaviors that actually computer models can better predict our personality than our friends and colleagues. These are some of the things we can predict. These are all traits around which you might target participants in future to make sure you have ranges. There are also traits that give you information on how to communicate with participants in a way that's going to match their profile and their expectations. This graph will show you how far we've come in terms of building models that predict personality. You'll see that with only 10 of your Facebook likes, so 10 pages, the model is more accurate at predicting ground truth personality on a test than your colleagues. The reason we're able to test this is because those millions of people taking those tests could also share their results and share the test with their friends. So we had a huge database of cross ratings where friends and family members and loved ones were rating each other's personalities, and we're effectively comparing the computer judge to the human judge. So with 70 likes, the model surpasses friends. With about 150, it surpasses family members. And with 300 likes, the computer model can more accurately predict your personality than your husband or wife. Now, if we live in a world where computers can know us better than our loved ones know us, think of the possibilities in terms of answering questions more quickly and having an iterative learning process when we think about our research. You can use language to do this too. So I really don't want to focus so much on Facebook today, because the reality is that platforms come and go, and we are digitizing more and more aspects of our behavior and ourselves. So whether that be our activity that we're digitizing, or indeed our genome in the coming years. Things like this can all be used for insight. And the next time you kind of think about answering a difficult question, one way to turn that around might be, what is a relevant digital footprint that I could request access to for my participants? So this is an example with language, where we see that extroverted and introverted people use very different language online. So you can use this both for prediction and for tailoring the way that you communicate. You can try this for yourselves if you like. The model is kind of meant to be as inclusive as possible, but the majority of the sample is US and UK, so it may not work for everyone, but hopefully in future we'll have more Turkish-specific footprints in there as well. And you can use open data. So give this a try. You can set your location to Istanbul or anywhere in the world, and we collected over 6.4 billion open data points from sources like UNESCO, the World Health Organization, the UN, census bureaus around the world. And what it lets you do is it takes your IP address, predicts your location, and then looks you up in that database to find location-based information on things like average income, air quality, likelihood of being in a car accident, life expectancy, life satisfaction, and so on. And what you can also do is see that psychology impacts those predictions. So if you know that someone is highly conscientious and well-organized, then there's prior research relating that to higher job performance and therefore a likelihood of a higher income. So be creative when you offer feedback to participants, because sometimes there's already data available that you can use to give them a benefit for participating. So what are some of the advantages of using this in practice? I've already mentioned you can access a retrospective record. So all of those clicks, those likes, that language occurred in a natural environment when the individual wasn't being assessed. And that's very, very valuable to researchers, because you can overcome some of the traditional biases that otherwise we'll have to do in the statistical process. You also get an expanded reference group, because when you ask people to compare themselves to people of their same age, gender, roughly the same socioeconomic group, what they're actually doing is comparing themselves to people they know or people they've met. So that might be a couple of hundred, maybe 1,000 people for the average person. But when you look at digital footprints, the reference group is actually huge. It can be millions or 10 millions of people. So you get a much wider variety of behavior within the sample, which lets you do more things in the analysis. We're talking about online today and mobile, and you know that engaging assessments that don't feel like tests can not only result in better participant experience, but often increase the value of the data and the quality of the data, because people are really motivated to be honest and engaged. And this lets you do real-time feedback, like I was showing, using open data, using social data. One thing that people maybe forget is that sometimes that digital footprint, although it's messy and uncontrolled, can actually be more accurate than memory. Let me give you an example. If I want to know about where someone sits in their social network, so I want to know how influential they might be, which node they are in a complex network, no matter how motivated that participant is to tell me the truth and give me an accurate answer, it's impossible for them to accurately recreate their complex network of friends and tell me exactly who's friends with whom, how long they've been friends for, what content they've shared with each other, and so on. Whereas I could, rather than doing that, I could share access to my social graph, which has that information quantified and cleaned and ready for analysis. So sometimes you can surpass the information that participants are actually capable of sharing with you too. Here's that example with the reference group. This is a study where we looked at whether opposites attract or whether people tend to hang out with people different to them. We found that, in fact, the idea that opposites attract isn't true. So people tend to make romantic partnerships and become friends with those who are more similar to them. And you see that the reference group in the behavior-based prediction of personality is much wider than that where people are comparing themselves to other people they've met. Those were the advantages in the way that we ask the questions and the way that we learn. But there are also advantages before you even bring people to the questionnaire. So thinking about targeting participants rather than kind of an open recruitment. And this is something I think you're all familiar with doing already. So I mentioned that study, My Personality, 2007, millions of people engaged with it. We didn't spend any money on data collection, and we didn't pay anyone to take part. It was purely through word of mouth, sharing, and people opting in after they received the benefit. So I think it's quite a different way of thinking about the data collection process, where you basically give the benefit away for free and then hope that people believe in what you're doing in order to share it. I know it can be risky, but our experience is that it can result in very, very high-quality data where people sit and answer 336 question surveys, just because they want to know the result at the end. You can also shorten or do away with some of those traditional kind of boring barriers to the research or to the insight, because a lot of that information is already available, for example, on someone's Facebook profile. So just ask for access to that, pre-fill it, and maybe ask them to correct it. So you can improve the experience. We are very fortunate in that, although the study ran mostly from 2007 to 2012, we've updated it and put it online, and now we have a huge participant community that whenever one of our students is running another survey, we just post it there and sometimes have 100,000 people within a day just completing those questionnaires. And not all of them are games, and not all of them have feedback, and not all of them are on Facebook. But if you actually invest time into that community and also invest time in keeping the application running and keeping it compliant, then you can recruit to new studies very, very quickly, and this speeds up the kind of operational side. I said about targeting, we can do psychological targeting, we can do demographic targeting through these existing infrastructures, but it's also a way to reach the kind of people that are normally very difficult to reach. So, for example, highly stigmatized groups or groups that don't want to come in or are unable to come into a kind of controlled environment, you can reach them through Facebook by targeting interests that are related to psychological or demographic factors. And ultimately, the goal here is to have much more large and heterogeneous samples so that your final outputs, research outputs, are more defensible. This is an example of how you might psychologically target people for studies. So I can input a profile here. In this example, I'm going after kind of young men who are artistic, impulsive, and kind of more on the team working side. And you can define this as discreetly, in as detailed a manner as you need. And you see how it kind of comes out. So liking these pages are correlated with being of this profile from a test. So you might expect that highly open, liberal and artistic people are more likely to be interested in poetry and philosophy. And those competitive people are basically really well-dressed, but really angry at everything. So you can start thinking about building that recruitment in terms of interest and in terms of psychology. Unstructured data can often be most informative. I think maybe you agree with me already, but how many times has it happened that someone goes to the doctor, they have a terrible experience, but they're embarrassed to click that unhappy button on the way out or fill in the survey form that they received 2 weeks later from their GP. It happens all the time, and there's a huge problem of over-reporting of satisfaction in health service, at least in the UK. So what those people do is they go home and then they complain about it on Facebook and Twitter. So very often the data that you need in order to improve patient care or quality is actually not in any of those traditional survey methods that we're used to doing, but it's in this unstructured, messy social media environment. And we're seeing a growing adoption and growing awareness of the utility of this data. So we ran a study with 35,000 people around the world, asking them how they think big data should be used. And we found that 84% of them, think that predictive technology should be used to improve the quality of healthcare, for example, by helping doctors provide personalized advice. In another study, the authors found that most people would share social media information with their doctor. So we're seeing a change here about people realizing that their data is an asset and is something that they can share with trusted individuals or trusted organizations to get better insight and to better manage their own health and their own behaviors. So far, I've just spoken to you about how amazing using digital footprints is, and hopefully you're kind of on board with the idea at least. But I have to caveat that with, this is a new area and there are a lot of challenges. So for a start, you're working with very large data, and we need to develop better skills within the social science research community for, programming in R, programming in Python, and so on, and being able to work with some of these data sets very quickly and efficiently. So what happens when you do snowball sampling, for example, is that because people are sharing it with their friends, your sample composition can often be weighted or biased towards those first early adopters. So there are always people online that pretty much will click anything and click around and then share it and then forget about it. So what you need to do is make sure you account for those hidden effects when you're collecting the data and maybe weight the participant groups differently. I said that platforms come and go, and I think this is true, and we've seen censorship of certain social media platforms temporarily in Turkey and elsewhere. So I'm not saying that you should put all your eggs in one basket, but I'm saying that diversifying the channels through which you contact participants, I think, is a good way of building resilience. You need to deal with extremely noisy, sparse, missing data. So there are 54 million likable objects on Facebook. Our current model uses about 130,000 of those, which is about 20%. So you can imagine that, out of the, it's very informative because it means it's an extremely high choice environment. So if someone actually clicks one of those things, it's a cleaner signal than you might think. But at the same time, you're dealing with very sparse matrices, and that involves some practical challenges. Computational skills I mentioned. These are online applications. Facebook changes its terms, changes its coding environment all the time. It's not a click and forget project. It's something that you need to maintain, make sure you speak to that community all the time. And ultimately, you never really know what's happening behind the scenes. So are people clicking your survey more this week than last week because you changed a feature? Or is it because the Facebook newsfeed or Twitter or Google has kind of changed something in the way it works? So you need to be wary of some of those hidden algorithms and not mistake changes in the platform for real trends in the data. Fake profiles are something people often worry about in the social media environment because it's very uncontrolled recruitment. But the reality is it's very, very easy to spot and remove those profiles from your data. So for example, someone who has just created their account a month ago and is not connected to any friends is pretty likely to just be creating it in order to participate. So you can look at that social graph and build authenticity, and this is something that the platforms already invest quite a lot of time in doing. Another category of challenges is, of course, the ethical challenges, and I said that all of our work is using opt-in data, but there is the temptation to use some of these techniques to do passive assessment on groups, or even to use public data. So many researchers will tell you that if it's public, it's okay to use. So if it's on Twitter, people have an expectation that that's public. But I disagree with that view. I think that just because something is public doesn't mean that people have a reasonable expectation that it will be used for a specific piece of research. So we always recontact those whose data might be used, even when it's in an anonymized format. So anonymization will be a big trend, and techniques for that in future are getting more and more sophisticated. There's a lack of formal guidelines for how to actually use digital footprints. So some of the most recent guidelines from institutional review boards are actually in 2011. So that kind of tells you all you need to know, really. And this is something we're working out as we go along with the research community, and we'll have time for questions, so I very much appreciate your contributions and your questions in that theme. Human subjects versus archival research. This is basically a point about what rules apply. In computer science, there's the tendency to say that internet research is kind of similar to archival research, so it's not really anything to do with individual privacy or participants. You're just accessing, as if you were going into a library. Whereas human subjects, requires ethical approval and so on. And this line is changing all the time. So as we see new environments like VR and AR being used in market research, how will we negotiate this divide as researchers? And when will we start trying to create our own guidelines so that we can set better practices for the future? Another challenge is algorithmic bias. As you'll see, there are many challenges. So please don't go away thinking that this is kind of easy to do. But at the same time, I'll show you an example of people actually doing it in practice besides ourselves. So that's kind of positive. Algorithmic bias is something to be aware of because a lot of the time with digital footprints, you're using historic data. So if you build an algorithm based on historic data and you don't take account of the prejudices in that data, then you can very quickly make a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where that AI just keeps perpetuating all of the problems of the past rather than solving them. So we as a community need to be aware of that and advocate the use of multidisciplinary approaches, so using both ethical approaches, psychological, computer science, and everything in between. So consent and privacy you already know very well. User-generated versus user-relevant content. So I can use someone's social network structure to study them, to study their position in it, but I don't think it's acceptable to use participants' friends to find out about them as well. So this is something you need to work out in practice. And this is an example of a company actually really kind of doing this. So this is a startup we worked with on a Innovate UK funded project. They use our API, Apply Magic Source API, to provide insights to their users. And their model is basically, it's mobile first, and all of that data that people submit to questionnaires is stored locally on your device. So you can back that up to the cloud, but ultimately that data sits with you. The brand or the company asking the questions never knows who the answers belong to. So you can pull in your data, you can pull in your Fitbit, you can pull in your Facebook, you can answer questions, you can trade 20 of your latest tweets, for £2 in cash or for some new insight. And this creates a personal data exchange, which is a very different way of thinking about traditional market research, I think. So it is possible, it is happening, and I think the industry is being disrupted by initiatives like this, which take a very different approach to privacy and data. So this is our kind of virtuous circle where digital footprints can hopefully help you in your day-to-day. So you can think about targeting participants in a more intelligent way, so looking at psychologically representative samples, not just those people who always like taking surveys. You can start predicting certain answers to questions. You can use those predictions to inform follow-ups. You can use them to present people with information they wouldn't otherwise have, and therefore build participant communities. And you, again, can do reporting in real time, where that prediction happens within half a second. And then you can learn and very quickly adapt and tailor your message. So please do take that idea on board and feel free to challenge it. The idea is that next time you might want to think about asking for consent to analyze a digital footprint rather than asking questions, and you might find more answers in that footprint than before. So thank you. Teşekkürler.